It is Pride Month this month, and I thought now would be a great time to make a video that I've been wanting to do for a long time. So I guess you can consider this both a coming out video and a sort of analysis of some things relevant to my life that I'd like to address. Hi, I'm trans. I'm trans and I'm non-binary. I came out in November of 2014 and all of my friends and family accepted me for who I am, and I've been very happy with where my life has gone since then. I live in a wonderful town and go to a wonderful school where I'm not treated any differently for being who I am, and I've become more active in the LGBT community since the start of 2015, and found a lot of very close friends and heard all sorts of amazing, touching stories about the trans experience. As I've become increasingly comfortable and happy in my own life since coming out, I've become increasingly uncomfortable with the online experiences, mostly because I've dealt with a lot of harassment and negativity. YouTube has kind of turned into a cesspool of ignorance and hate, and while I expect better of my audience, and I have good faith to assume that my viewers will be reasonable even if they disagree with me, I've encountered an increasing number of ignorant people who seem to only want to pick a fight with anything they don't understand, rather than seeking to understand. I don't need my viewers to agree with me, but I'm disinterested in the kinds of harassment I've seen, and I want to step in and say the following. If you aren't okay with trans people, don't watch my videos. I'm a trans person myself, and I won't allow hostility towards my existence to become the norm for my viewer base, especially because all that does is get in the way of any meaningful discussion. I want to talk about transphobia a bit because not only is it personally relevant, it's also something I've spent a lot of time refuting using a combination of science, sociology, and personal experience. So for this video, I'd like to take some very common transphobic talking points and explain why they're wrong as quickly as I can. It probably won't be very quick, but I at least hope it's painless. Let's begin. There are only two genders. No, this is a misunderstanding of what gender is. There are four different kinds of meanings to gender. There's gender at an institutional level, otherwise known as a gender system. There's gender at an interactional level, otherwise known as gender expression. There's gender at an individual level, otherwise known as gender identity. And there's gender at a biological level, otherwise known as sex. Gender as a system refers to categories that we develop in order to differentiate people based on sexual, reproductive, familial, and related social roles. Gender expression refers to how we demonstrate our social roles to others via the way we express ourselves, including our appearance, how we dress, speech patterns, mannerisms, and many other things associated with masculinity and femininity. Gender identity refers to how we individually identify with the categories of a gender system, including identifying as men, as women, as both, as neither, as one or the other at various times, and so on. Gender as biology refers to the associated sexual and reproductive roles corresponding to our genitalia, such as penis and vagina, otherwise known as male and female. If we're arguing that there are only two gender categories, this is untrue. Historically, other cultures have developed gender systems in which there were more than two gender categories, including a third gender. Within our culture, we still see non-binary people, including agender people who are neither man nor woman and so technically fit into a third category, thus demonstrating that there are more than two gender categories that are possible. As to whether or not there are more than two gender categories that are acceptable, technically in the West, the predominant model of gender accepts two when it comes to legal institutions and various cultural norms, but systems can be changed, and we're on the verge of the potential beginning of recognizing non-binary genders legally. Whether or not this is acceptable will be a point of contention for transphobes, but I'm not exactly here to sympathize. I'm here to educate. And transphobic rhetoric may be pervasive, but it won't stop the social change that we are very likely to see within the next decade or so. If we are arguing that there are only two biosex categories, male and female, then I'm sorry to say, but that's untrue. Intersex people exist and can indeed exist with ambiguous genitalia, not definitively male or female at birth. This means that literally there are more biological configurations than just the two. Whether or not we accept intersex people into the discussion is not a matter of biological reality, but a matter of biological expectation. The reality is that intersex people exist. The expectation is that people will be biologically male or female. This expectation is arguably not acceptable when discussing intersex rights and the right to our own bodily autonomy. The doctor performing corrective surgery may be valuable in cases where the baby's health is at risk, but we've seen that people born with ambiguous genitalia are not necessarily at a health risk for it, and that performing surgery can actually increase health risk rather than reduce it. As such, it's arguable that there being two distinct biosex categories is actually contradicted by the biological reality of intersex people. Now let's address that phrase. Biological reality. A lot of people use the term biological reality in order to try to invalidate trans people by saying that it doesn't matter what we identify as, because we're ignoring the biological reality. That, for example, I am biologically male, so it doesn't matter if I identify as a woman. This is wrong for two reasons. One is that gender identity demonstrably has no direct ties to biology, with the concept of brain sex being pretty easy to refute. Brain sex relies on the notion of hormones having a major play in the development of gender identity, and this is a fundamental misunderstanding of hormones. In reality, hormones are more of a reactive chemical to socialization processes, and as such, a man has higher testosterone levels not because testosterone makes the man, but because gender norms incentivize competitiveness in men. And men who engage in more competitive activities, which is more likely because they're socialized to do so, are more likely to have higher testosterone levels. A lot of brain sex arguments also relate largely to results. That differences in how men and women think and how men and women perform in various intellectual activities demonstrate that there is some sort of fundamental difference between the brains of men and women. This is basically glossing over the actual reasoning for why men and women perform differently in order to try to essentialize social differences as being biological differences. Oftentimes, the reason why men and women perform differently and think differently is because of social norms. Men are taught to be competitive, taught to be aggressive, and are given both the privilege and expectation by society to dominate intellectual fields. As a result, women face a lot of discrimination when being involved in fields dominated by men, and are less likely to succeed because of the issues women have to face in order to be involved in male-dominated fields. Shaun from YouTube channel Shaun and Jen has a great video detailing this concept as it relates to chess, which I'll link in the description. Similarly, intellect is sort of a nebulous term that itself has a definition that's favorable to men. If something is stereotyped as being a masculine intellectual activity, it's seen as more intellectual than any activity stereotyped as being feminine. The second reason why biological reality is wrong is because it's actually meaningless. The term they're actually looking for is biological truth, and when we distinguish the two, it becomes more easily apparent why a biosex basis for gender is inaccurate. The term reality refers to physical phenomena, the realm of the real. What this means is that physical existence is what constitutes reality. Meanwhile, truth refers to language, the realm of discourse. What constitutes truth is statements that correspond with what constitutes reality. This is some really vague theory kind of stuff, so let me demonstrate what I mean. Words on their own are just sounds. They're just noises that we make with our mouths. Language is developed based on attaching certain sounds to certain concepts. It's similar to an algebra equation. If 2 plus x equals 4, then you can substitute the meaningless non-number x for the actual number 2, and the equation will be accurate. Similarly, a word is sort of like the language equivalent of a variable, a sound that serves as a substitute for a concept. So when we say, I sat down in my chair, we understand the sentence because we understand that the term chair is really just shorthand for seat with legs and a back designed for a single person. And so since we know what the term is referring to, we can understand the sentence. This is really splitting hairs, but it's also really important to understanding biosex. To explain the difference between reality and truth, I'll stick with the chair example. If I say this chair is real, we can agree that it is. But if I say that this chair is true, that statement won't make sense because how can a chair be true? By reversing it though, we can say I sat down in my chair is true, but saying I sat down in my chair is real doesn't make much sense. So truth refers to statements that reflect reality. As such, biological truth is what people really mean when they say biological reality, because the reality is the physical phenomena of genitalia. Biological truth is the statement that a person with a penis is male. The term male is just shorthand for the physical phenomenon of a human being with a penis. In that sense, we can see male as a list of biological traits that we expect to see from someone who has a penis, and we can see man as a list of social traits that we expect to see from someone who has a penis. Male is seen as a biological truth, and man as a social truth. Are you with me? The reason why I distinguished the concept of biological truth from the concept of biological reality is that when we discuss someone being biologically male, we are not referring to the realm of the real, but the realm of discourse. The thing about the realm of discourse is that it's constructed from social meanings. What this means is that the very idea of someone being biologically male is itself a construct of language. Another example that I think really demonstrates the difference between truth and reality is the notion of the sun revolving around the earth. The idea that the sun revolved around the earth was true at the time because the observations they had at the time led them to believe that the sun must revolve around the earth. As new information came out, their perception of reality changed, and with it, so did the truth of the matter. The earth revolves around the sun. Reality itself had never changed. The earth had always revolved around the sun, but the public and scientific discourse changed to reflect the new information. Reality is absolute. Truth is contingent. The supposed biological truth of trans women being biologically male is based on an interpretation of the information that reality provides. People appear to be born with penises or vaginas, and so we constructed the categories of male and female to reflect this physical phenomenon. In recent years, new information has become increasingly common that contests the idea that there is an essential distinction between the two. The categories we construct around biology can change, and I argue they should change as we collect new information. Intersex conditions demonstrate that the male-female dichotomy is not real, but is socially constructed. If it were a true dichotomy, there would be no exceptions. Gerald N. Callahan, an associate professor of microbiology at Colorado State University, and who wrote a book on intersex people titled Between XX and XY, said in an interview, quote, "The persistence of intersex reminds me that there's a continuum, that we isolate people in the middle and say that they have a problem because they're reproductively incompetent or don't look right or whatever. None of us meet the criterion of being the perfect male or the perfect female. We are all intersex." End quote. Following from that, biological reality does not actually differentiate people. We do through discourse. In a sense, everyone's biological makeup is entirely unique to themselves. Certainly, a person who has a penis will have different genitals from someone who has a vagina, but similarly, a person who has a penis will have different genitals than someone else with a penis. Just as every single chair is going to be slightly different from the next one, every single person will have different biological features, including cis women with face hair, cis men with wider hips or smaller shoulders, people with ambiguous genitalia, and so on. It's not much of a stretch to say that if some women can have face hair, some women can have flat chests, some women can have XY chromosomes while still having a vagina, then some women can have a penis too. As such, the categories of male and female no longer reflect all of the information we have available about biological configurations. Thus, to say that a trans woman is biologically male and that this is somehow a biological reality is not accurate. Nobody is really biologically male. We really do have penises and vaginas. We really do have XY and XX chromosomes. These things are real, but the categories we use to distinguish people based on these expected features are based on expectations that simply don't reflect what we actually see occur. As such, biologically male carries no meaning beyond trying to assert that a trans woman is a man, simply because we expect people born with penises to be men, even though this is not substantiated by biology, psychology, or sociology. Male socialization. This is one that comes a lot from TERFs and is used specifically against trans women. The idea is that trans women are men because we are socialized to be men, that we are taught messages about what it means to be a man, and we are given male privilege, and we internalize masculine behaviors and mindsets because of the socialization process raising us to be men. Simply put, even if we identify as women, we are really men when it comes to how we act and think, so it doesn't matter how we identify. This is very obvious bullshit to anyone who understands socialization. First of all, when it comes to messages we receive about what it means to be a man, everyone sees those messages, no matter who you are. We all see messages about what it means to be a man or a woman, and trans men internalize the messages of womanhood, not of manhood. Demonstrably so. Most trans women see masculine gender expectations growing up as some of the most traumatic moments of their upbringing, myself included. Having the internal gender identity of womanhood with the expectations of masculinity pushed onto us has devastating effects for us psychologically, with a lot of trans women having PTSD, personality disorders, and anxiety disorders from experiences we had while in the closet. Second, Socialization is not a blank slate process. No socialization theorist argues so. Instead, it's a give and take, where we internalize some things and reject other things, and our perspective and autonomy within our own lives can go a long way in how much we internalize. Being a trans woman, it becomes difficult to internalize masculine messages growing up because it conflicts with our conception of ourselves as women. As a result, we don't internalize the messages, but we still fear the consequences of failing to comply with gender norms. In my own life, this didn't translate into putting on a masculine persona. It translated into sitting in my bedroom and crying a lot because I didn't understand why men were so awful to me. I literally could not internalize the idea that I needed to be more manly, and that caused a great level of stress. In this sense, trans men don't undergo male socialization but closeted woman socialization. We internalize messages of womanhood and have a self-perception of womanhood, thus the identity of a woman, but we have to keep these in the closet throughout our early life. As such, we don't develop masculine habits or mindsets, but are harmed for being incapable of doing so. This is very much in line with what we expect to see via socialization theory. Just as cis women internalize the identity of womanhood and often experience trauma at the face of what men expect them to be, so do trans women. It's just that men expect us to be two things simultaneously. The messages we internalize are about how we need to behave as women, and yet the messages that are inflicted on us by men are how we need to behave as men. We reject the masculine messages and internalize the messages of womanhood, but both are used to harm and traumatize us. Given this, male privilege goes out the window. Trans women do not have male privilege because privilege is something afforded to people by society. Male privilege is not based on biosex. It's based on gender identity, and this is demonstrable because as soon as trans women come out, any notion of privilege goes right out the window. High rates of discrimination, poverty, harassment, and violence for trans people. High rates of familial rejection and very few legal protections. Trans women often have to go into sex work in order to survive, and none of these things resemble male privilege in any way. We are not afforded privileges after we come out. Instead, we lose any that we may have had. As for privileges afforded to trans women in the closet, this is privilege at the expense of identity. It's what I call conditional privilege, and it is not actually privilege. It's similar to the idea that women have privilege online as long as they don't say they're women. The phrase tits or GTFO, for example, alludes to the idea that you are a man online until proven otherwise, and if you say you're a woman, you have to prove it. If you never out yourself as a woman online, you retain the supposed privilege of being seen as a man online, and you face less harassment as a result. But the problem is here that you are severely limited in how you can interact online. You can't show your face, you can't show your voice, you can't act like yourself, you must pretend to be something you're not. Otherwise, you face increased harassment, including sexual harassment, and increased risk of all sorts of abuse, such as the kind we saw with Gamergate. You do not have privilege if you have to constantly self-police in order to retain said privilege and erase your identity in the process. This is true of women online, and it's true of trans women in the closet. Conditional privilege is not privilege. And to tie the two concepts together, being a closeted trans woman online has led to a lot of harassment because I didn't self-police enough to avoid being harassed. And being an out trans woman online has led to me being stalked and harassed even more, which I also anticipate will happen even more after this video comes out. The male socialization and male privilege arguments, simply put, are bullshit. Trans is a mental illness. Actually, no. Trans was a mental illness. Actually, no, scratch that. It was never a mental illness. It was just written into the books as one when they came up with terms such as autogenophilia and gender identity disorder. This was a medicalization of trans identities, and it happened in the past with gay people and straight people alike, with the medical terms homosexual and heterosexual both being coined in the late 1800s to describe a mental illness, a fetishization of same-gender and opposite-gender sexual relations, respectively. Heterosexuality became destigmatized and taken off the books as a mental disorder around the 1920s, and homosexuality became destigmatized and taken off the books as a mental disorder, I believe sometime around the 1980s or 1990s. Trans as a mental disorder was taken off the DSM-5 back in 2013, as gender identity disorder was replaced with gender dysphoria. This was done for a few reasons. One was, as the American Psychiatric Association themselves explained, was to get rid of the idea that trans people were in any way disordered. Second was because they recognized that the condition of stress that trans people experience was not a disorder of identity similar to a personality disorder or a dissociative identity disorder, but instead a condition that could only be alleviated through transition and destigmatizing trans identities in society and in individual relationships. Science does not argue anymore that trans is a mental illness and emphatically argues the opposite. So don't look to scientific explanations in order to defend transphobia. Trans people are more likely to commit suicide after transitioning. This argument was made based on a single study from Sweden. The study was conducted from the 70s until about 2003. The study concluded that trans people who transitioned had higher rates of suicide than the general population of people. The study did not conclude that trans people were at higher risk of suicide if they transitioned than if they didn't transition. It's true that trans people have a higher risk of suicide than the general population, but the study itself admitted that the suicide rates were related to cultural stigma, violence, and harassment against trans people. More recent studies have shown that the leading cause of suicide among trans people is not regret for transition, but sexual assault. The rate for sexual assault victims among trans people is 1 in 2. 1 in 2 trans people will be a victim of sexual assault, which is staggeringly high, and so high rates of suicide are actually expected given this statistic. However, other, more recent studies that were conducted past 2003 have found that trans people are actually much more psychologically healthy when allowed to transition. The statistics do not show any evidence to support the idea that trans people become suicidal because of regretting transition. The statistics overwhelmingly support that allowing trans people to transition and treating their gender identity as valid is vital to our psychological health. Sorry, but the problem isn't transition. It's transphobia. Why can't you just be a feminine man? Why can't I just be an androgynous, non-binary trans woman? And why can't you mind your own business? Thanks for watching, and have a happy Pride Month, everyone!